And while you think about those questions, I will move to the latest panelist as he has a very unique point of view. So while we have the benefit and the unique occasion to hear an extremely relevant perspective, I would invite the participant and the audience in the meantime to start thinking about the question. Now, we have heard from preventive technologies, scientific technologies, differences between the US and the rest of Europe. Mark, you have an extremely well-known expert on forensic technology, publisher, researcher, very known scientist. What is your opinion as a professional who has used the biological classic, so to say, forensic technology? What is the role of the technology? How can we bring the forensic application to timber to the same level of the biology we're used to know now? And based on your experience in working with law enforcement, what should we do to bridge this gap and ensure that we can be as reliable and as known and as included in the procedure as the other one? Please, the floor is yours.
Well, it's relating to the second part. How do you establish a good connection so that everybody talks to everybody and understands each other? It's that is hard to say. Usually I just try to speak in very simple terms and sentences. And like Ryan said, you can try to fake the most, he did not say that, I'm saying that. You can try to find the most simple piece of evidence and deliver it, but in my case, it is easy to just leave that to anybody who is related. So I just put everything on the table as long as this is allowed. Because in many cases, I get a contract because I'm officially sworn in and certified expert, so I'm a freelancer. And if somebody does not allow me to ever say anything about the case, then I'm bound to that. And then I just won't say anything. But just to give you an example that relates to wood, I wouldn't say timber in particular, but wood. This is from the oldest German criminalistic journal, and we just had an article there. It's called Archiv für Kriminologie, Archives of Criminology, even though it's criminalistics, not criminology. And we got a case that was, in my opinion, that is more or less the same as one of the timber cases. It was pieces of woods, and they looked like this. They were used as printing stock, so you can print something in very old books. Now, this is a matter of forgery and fraud to a very high degree, because sometimes you get old paper, but and then you just make it valuable by printing something on it that allegedly is a piece out of a book that is very rare. It could be hundreds of years old. And then if you test the paper is allegedly that old. So this is wood. You're talking about paper, you're talking about wood. But our idea was not to so much rely on that, because old paper is available and still can be forged, but to look at the printing stamps, the motifs that are printed onto the paper, which are also made of wood. And some of these pieces of wood can be traced back by looking at the dendrochronology. That means you look at the rings that are inside of the wood. And since many experts have databases that often are stacked in their basement, they have thousands and tens of thousands of pieces of wood, and then they built an overlay over all these little rings that you have in the wood, so they can tell you exactly not only when this tree was cut, but also probably from which region it comes. Now that may sound interesting for you when it comes to region and time, but at the same time probably you're saying, okay, it's just old books, we don't care that much. But the technique is just the same, because the problem that we have sometimes on these pieces of paper, we don't have the rings. So the technology is there, the database is there, the nerdy expert somewhere in the basement is there. It could be a museum in many cases, something like that. But the thing is, you just don't have the rings, because some types of wood don't produce them properly, and that is a problem relating to timber. It comes from regions where the seasons are relatively evenly distributed. So you don't have much of a difference between the different seasons. So what we do in those cases is we just use little chips of the wood. And now we come back to the problem, are you allowed to do that or not? So, somebody must allow us legally to take pieces of wood. They are really relatively small. This is just, I wouldn't say scratchings, but it's just pieces and scrapings. For example, just to give you a rough idea of how much it is, you scrape it off a corner and then you check for the radioactive change in the wood. And that, what you get out of that looks like this. And of course, everybody's falling asleep straight away once they see a diagram. But the diagram is beautiful because it doesn't matter if you like diagrams or if you don't like diagrams. What you can see is that you get a relatively clear, and that is now interesting for everybody else who works in the field, you get a relatively clear peak out of which year this comes. So in this case that I'm showing you, we know for sure that either the wood came from 1955. That is a very small peak, so we can tell in the courtroom how likely that is. That's the small peak there. Or with a much higher probability, it comes from the years between, in this case, let's say 1999, just roughly. So if you present that in the court, then you could always say, okay, if you don't believe me or if you don't believe the lab, like you heard before, from which country it comes or depending which technology it uses, just use another scraping and give it to a different lab because they will come to the same conclusion, because it's not so much a problem of the particular technological, let's say, machine that you use, but it's just radioactive carbon. And this is something that probably the jury may or may not understand in countries where you have a jury, but it's more relevant in my position that I'm in now to tell the police or to tell whoever, art dealers, collectors, agencies for, like WWF or any agency that you heard today about that is related to that matter, to give them a very, very strong proof. So it's worth pushing into that direction. You have heard of all the problems. You have hundreds and thousands of certificates, and just one person, has to deal with that. I guess Shelley mentioned that. Or you have to prove, like in the United States, that somebody had the knowledge and knew about that. So before you continue to proceed, you really want to know, let's say as a policeman or policewoman, is this sound and proof, and will this stand? And when you come to our nerdy compartments, this is going to stand. That I can guarantee. Or, like you heard before, we would say it's not black and white. No, that was you heard that from one of the panelists before, and then we just say no, it's not like a 100% probability, but the probability, and now comes the criminalistic part, is very high because we don't have to prove that this wood comes from, let's say, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 850 years ago. This is not something that you are interested in. You just want to distinguish between, does it come from 1955 or does it come from last year? And that we can do with black and white precision. If you would have a different question, then no. But in that particular case, we can do that. And that is typical for criminalistics. In criminalistics, we reply to a question that is actually of relevance for somebody who is asking the question. Police, organizations, whoever. And that is why it can be sometimes interesting to use criminalistic techniques, because they stand in the court, they relate to the actual case, they may have very high precision, even though from a scientific statistical standpoint they may not have that in a scientific conference. But your container full of timber is not a scientific conference matter. It's just, you do have additional information. For example, GPS data, phone data, mass phone data. If it comes to be a criminalistic case, you can use cell phone data and tons of other information. So that is what we do. We look at the single case and connect it to whatever the actual question is. That's criminalistics. Could be a homicide, could be, a forgery, could be a timber forest crime, could be anything. That's how we do it.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the interesting remarks and from your experience. Now, unfortunately, we only have the last 5 minutes, even though I would love to keep the panel running as long as possible. But I have a question open to the panelists that I'm sure is well shared by the audience. Feel free to answer by a round table, so we'll pass to every of you the word. So we'll start with Victor and then Lisa, Shelley, Ryan, and Mark to briefly close the session with 1 minute on where do we go from here. We have seen the technologies, where do we want to bring them, where can we expect the technology to go, and especially the age-old question. We have already some technology, how do we make them pervasive into investigation? How can we be sure that these become standard operating procedures in investigation? So I will start with Victor and then pass in about a minute time frame to the other participant. So Victor, please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Marcelo. So I think there needs to be a clear communication between the science, the prosecution, and then also maybe companies on what we can deliver, what is reasonably to be expected, and if you have a question, what answer can we get? In my own experience, I've noticed that sometimes enforcement is even more hesitant to rely on these techniques compared to companies who come voluntarily to figure out how can they make their supply chain proof or legal. And even then we get the same problem again, that it's not always clear to what they exactly want to have answered and what we can provide. And that's why I think panels like this are very important, that we can show what we can actually deliver. I think that is the main point that I want to leave on the table. A reasonable expectation of the answer that you want to get.
Thank you. Then I'll just jump in and go. I agree. I think the cooperation is the main points to work towards, and working on all sides. Potentially with a party we're missing here, someone who can do the actual field checks. Because I think with the forensic and the baseline analysis on a report, we can say in what region something coarsely comes from. First of all, whether there's something absolutely wrong or not, and then in what region something coarsely comes from. With remote sensing, we can say, well, this species only grows in that part where there is 95% illegal logging, for example, or where there's 80% legal. Maybe not convincing in court, but then we have got it narrowed down to the case where there is something obvious happening, and then there can be a further potential field validation party, or a more in-depth analysis that's specialized on this particular case, and then law enforcement can act. But to get to that final step, I think you would need the full chain to be present.
Please, Shelley.
I guess I will stick with what my focus was on risk assessment. I think that getting the risk assessment automated and using it in amongst our agencies and our wood identification laboratories as well. And given that this is something that could be done at the customs level, or in this case, APHIS, who are looking at the paperwork, automating that, giving them more time. Number one, you would arrive at some kind of an automated conclusion that would indicate to them whether forensic techniques are needed or not, and where they need to go next. And then the other is that if they are freed up from endless trying to get this information that should be automated and easy to do, they would have more time to focus and resources to focus on using forensic technologies. And then, there'd be one thing to then get this disseminated within and integrated within the U.S. And all the agencies that are working on Lacey Act and CITES, but then using and continuing to work with, especially the UNODC Container Control Program, who are constantly going around the world and training and talking about risk identification and wood identification and other forensic technologies that would follow. And I think that, I was talking about how we've gotten, not totally easily, but pretty rapidly correcting errors. That's important. We've gotten, specialized, at least one type of specialized report automated. But I think that going forward in the future that will make this happen and get this integrated with forensics is automating the spotting of anomalies or inconsistencies. That's harder. So this is going to be, that's crucial, and it could reveal really good risk indicators, which we could then find trends and share with everyone else. I mean, the misspellings are probably unintended, but inconsistencies among the data could definitely be marked for further scrutiny and for patterns, what's happening. And this, so we'll, within the next year or two, we want to bring together external data that is going into Arbor Harbor, and then connecting that with declaration data, and then hopefully publishing even a methodology that we could share with everyone.
Thank you, Charlie. Please, Ryan, and then right after Mark. We also have some questions, so please keep the intervention to 1 minute so we can go over the question from the audience.
Thank you, and I'll keep it very brief. I think from a prosecution point of view, we just have to do it. That's what is next. We can always worry about the cost and the chain of custody and who goes first, but success breeds success, and courts are more comfortable when other courts have dealt with it, but this is still relatively new. So we need to increase the volume of cases that we are bringing, and that's when we catch people in ports, and we also need to be bringing the cases that are proactive, where we went out and looked at that area of the forest, so we knew it was coming, so we're waiting for them. So I think simply by doing it, and historically in the US, we are reluctant to rely on other legal systems, but I think this is an example because the Lacey Act allows it. So when I can say, you know, British courts have done this, Nigerian courts have done this, it was accepted in New Zealand, that carries weight in this field. And I think that's where we have the team, that's why we're here. And we just need to get more of those cases in front of our courts and judicial system. Thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly too, I think there's an elephant in the room. I drew it. I cannot draw very properly, but I tried to draw it. The elephant here is the problem that in most cases, or in many cases, it's probably not so much about the wood or the timber, but it's about the deforestation. And that happens because people eat eggs and drink milk and eat bacon and schnitzels and whatnot. So as long as people don't go vegan, there will just be this byproduct of wood and forest deforestation. And if this, I mean, we are dealing here with the criminalistic, the forensics, the procedural and structural side, which is perfect. But at the same time, as long as people try to eat up the planet, then nothing is going to change, because all the space that is a deforestation space is going to be used, or much of it, to grow food for animals that are later eaten, which does not make any sense.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now, following the remarks from Victor on the charcoal, I will really feel bad if I will ever try a barbecue this summer. So I think I will have to opt for a lot of vegetables, rice, and some traditional Italian pasta. So I will stick to my duties.